Chapter 21 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 21. Save for a little impatience when his judgment was impugned, or somebody questioned the soundness of his opinions, Moreno was a person of the most equable temperament, and singularly light-hearted. Still, when he rose early on the morning of this most eventful day, he was in a very grave and thoughtful mood. He was playing a most difficult and dangerous game. Even if he outwitted the heads of the Brotherhood in Spain, as he believed he had, there was left Lecouet and Jacques in London to deal with. To save Guy Rossett was easy enough. He had laid his plans very surely for that. But he had to save himself, also to save Violet Hargrave. In the plausible explanations that he would have to give in London, there must be no loopholes. Very early in the morning he again saw the Chief of Police, in company with Farquhar, who, now that the game was really afoot, was manifesting a keen interest in the chase. They rehearsed the whole programme all over again. "He is cleverer than I thought him at first," whispered Moreno to his friend, when the somewhat stout man had withdrawn for a moment to consult one of his lieutenants. "But I am relying on you to be constantly at his elbow. You are not the sort of chap to get flurried." And Farquhar, although quite a modest kind of fellow, agreed that he could keep his head in a crisis. At 11 o'clock, as arranged, Moreno presented himself at the lodgings of Mrs. Hargrave. She looked very pale, and there were dark rings round her eyes. It was easy to see that her night had been a perturbed one, that she had enjoyed little or no sleep. "You don't look in the best of health and spirits," he said kindly. "Well, you have got to pluck up your courage. You will have plenty of it for the next 24 hours." She shivered. "If I had known what I was going in for, I would never have yielded to Jacques' entreaties," she said. "You never quite know what you will be landed in when you embark in these enterprises," answered the man lightly. "Well, now to business. You still want to be absent from that meeting to-night?" "If it is possible." "It is quite possible. But you will have to rely on me, and you will also have to be very brave." He drew out of his pocket a small, dark-coloured vial, and held it to the light. "You see that?" he asked. "Well, this is going to be your salvation." She shivered again. Her nerves were very much out of order this morning, but she began to have an idea of what he was driving at. "This is the secret, then, that you would not tell me last night? I have got to drink that?" Moreno nodded. "Yes, if you are still in the same mind as you were yesterday. In my very early youth I was apprenticed to a chemist. I very soon began to acquire a wide knowledge of drugs and their properties." They had been standing up to the present. Moreno pointed to a sofa. "We can talk more easily if we sit. I have mixed you here a perfectly safe compound, which I want you to drink before I leave, so that I can take away the bottle. I would prefer it was not left lying about, you understand." She looked at him with eyes that expressed a great dread. "What effect will it have?" "I tell you frankly, about 6 or 7 o'clock you will feel very ill, very faint. Those effects will last for the best part of 12 hours. A few hours after that you will be yourself again." She looked at him narrowly. A dark wave of suspicion had suddenly flowed over her mind. She was sure, with a woman's certain intuition, that he was greatly attracted by her. Still, she knew nothing of him. He had always said he was a true son of the Revolution, although she had somewhat distrusted the sincerity of that statement. Had he, out of loyalty to the cause, revealed her perfidy to others, and was he deputed by them to poison her, under the specious pretext of falling in with her wishes? He read her dark, suspicious thoughts as easily as he would have read an open book. He spoke very gently, very tenderly. She had never appealed to him more than at this moment, with her pallid cheeks, the haunting dread in her eyes. "My dear, you do not trust me, I can see. Your mind is full of doubt. Well," he stooped and kissed her, "I can only swear by everything I hold holy and sacred, that I would not harm a hair of your head. No man could lie so convincingly as that." She reached out her hand for the vial, then quickly drew it back. "I am afraid, dreadfully afraid," she murmured in a low voice. "I don't know which to choose, to do as you tell me, or to go to that dreadful place." "You must do as you please." He was still very patient, but she noticed there was a certain coldness in his tones. She rose and walked about the room, wringing her hands. Her faith in him had come back, but she was still terribly afraid. "It is early yet," said Moreno presently. "You will have plenty of time to send round for Contraras and throw yourself on his compassion. Implore him not to compel you to assist at the condemnation, perhaps the execution, of a man who was once your lover. He might give way." "The last thing he would do. He would think it was a grand opportunity to show my fidelity to the cause. He would let nothing stand in the way if it were his own case." "I agree with you now as I agreed before when we discussed the same subject. Well, you must make up your mind. Take this or wait here, and come with Alvedero tonight." She was still wavering, torn between faith and doubt. "But you said you could save Guy Rossett. Is there any doubt of that?" And Moreno, out of his pity for the woman, out of the attraction she possessed for him, spoke more plainly than he had intended. "There is great doubt of it. But even if I could save Guy Rossett, I doubt if I could save you. I might just manage to save myself." And then, in a flash, she understood, and she doubted him no longer. "I think I see it all now. You are no more a true son of the cause than I am a true daughter. I sold their secrets for money. You would betray them for the same or other reasons." Moreno did not answer the question directly. He simply held out the phial towards her. "Will you drink this or not?" She took it from him with a hand that no longer trembled. "Yes, I believe you now. I will drink it. Tell me what I am to do, how I am to act when it begins to take effect." "Do nothing. Just go to the sofa and lie down. In a few minutes you will be in a stupor, unconscious of everything and everybody. Your landlady may come up. She can act as she pleases, send for a doctor or not. Probably nobody will come near you till Alvedero arrives. When he sees you there, he can act as he pleases too. Anyway, he cannot stay long, because he will be due at the Brotherhood, to whom he will bring the report of your sudden indisposition." "And if the doctor comes, will he not guess?" "Dios!" cried Moreno, relapsing for a moment into Spanish. "You will be all right again long before the doctor has picked out your complaint from a dozen others that present similar symptoms." She pulled the cork from the phial and sniffed the contents. "There is no odour about it," she said. "Not the slightest," said Moreno quietly. "I took very good care of that. I think if the doctor does come, he will be a bit puzzled." She drank it down at a draught, then handed the bottle back to her visitor. "I am an adventuress, and you are, well, a sort of adventurer," she said with a half smile. "Well, you see, I have given you a proof of my faith in you." Moreno put the phial into his pocket and held out his hand. "Goodbye for the present." "Shall I see you tomorrow?" asked Violet as she walked with him to the door. "You say after 12 hours I shall be myself again." "Certainly," answered Moreno in his gayest tones. Yes, whatever betided, he would certainly see her tomorrow. Her trust in him had made her more attractive than ever. On the whole, he thought he had done the best for her. Once he had thought of getting the Spanish police to arrest her on some false charge, with the view of letting her go as soon as all danger was past. But this method did not appeal to him very greatly. The police would be glad enough to get her into their clutches, but they might not care to let her go so easily. Too much explanation might be necessary in the first instance. And he always had to adapt his policy to the view of what questions might be asked in London. The tale she could tell now would be a very simple one. She had been attacked in the evening by a sudden seizure, had relapsed into unconsciousness, and been oblivious of everything till the next day. That evening, at a few minutes past 9, Alvedero knocked at the door of the mean house. When the landlady opened it, he perceived that she was in a great state of agitation. "Oh, Signor, something terrible has happened. I went up to Madame's room some 20 minutes ago, to take her light supper. She was lying unconscious on the sofa, and she has not stirred since." Alvedero bounded up the stairs, entered the room, and gazed on the motionless form. At first he thought she was dead, but on placing his hand on her heart, he could feel it beating. "She looks as if she were dying. Have you sent for a doctor?" "Yes, after I found that I could not pull her round, I sent my husband to fetch the first one he could find." Alvedero reflected as to his course of action. Humanity suggested that he should stay by the side of the insensible woman till the doctor arrived and gave his opinion as to her condition. But humanity was not a particular trait of the Brotherhood, and Alvedero had less of it than most of his colleagues. He had arrived 5 minutes late. He had spent another 5 minutes here. If he left at once, he would still be keeping his colleagues waiting. Besides, what good could he do? If the woman were not dying, as he believed she was, it must be hours before she recovered. The tribunal must sit without her. The sooner he went and informed them of that fact, the better. He turned towards the door and spoke a few parting words to the landlady. "Don't leave her till the doctor comes. Obey whatever instructions he gives you promptly. I will see that you are rewarded for your trouble. I will look in again in 2 or 3 hours from now. Please sit up for me." He walked a few yards down the street where a cab was waiting. He entered it and was driven rapidly towards an obscure portion of the town. Half an hour later Isobel was sitting in the drawing room alone. Her host and hostess had gone on a visit to some friends who lived near. Guy had not been able to see her during the day, as he had been too busily engaged with his official duties. He had sent round a note telling her he would be round in the evening. She was expecting him every minute. There was a tap at the door. The maid entered with a letter. The gentleman who had brought it was waiting in the hall for an answer. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope at once as that of her cousin, Maurice Farquhar. She tore it open and read the few pencilled words. "I want to see you at once. It is about Mr Rossett." She rushed out into the hall and almost pulled him into the room. "What is it?" she panted in terrified tones. "Something has happened to Guy." "Yes, something has happened, but you must be brave and not give way. He has been trapped by the anarchists, but all will be well. Moreno assures me that he has foreseen this and will save him. I am now on my way to do my share in the rescue." "Can I come with you?" pleaded Isobel. "I shall go mad if I stop here." For a moment Farquhar hesitated. He had a rooted dislike to women mixing themselves up in dangerous or turbulent scenes, but her pleading eyes overcame his scruples. "Yes, if you wish. I have a cab waiting. Leave a note for these people here explaining your absence. Then put on your things and come with me. I will explain everything as we go along." A few minutes later they were seated side by side, driving to the same obscure quarter of the town which had long ago been reached by the Spaniard anarchist Alvedero. End of chapter 21. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 22 of Whither Thou Goest by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 22. In a shabby room of a shabby house, in one of the most obscure quarters of Madrid, 5 men were sitting. They were Contraras, Zorrilta, Alvedero, Moreno, and Somoza, the fisherman of Fontarrabia. "Guy Rossett is here in the next room." It was Moreno who spoke. He turned to the fisherman. "Has he recovered sufficiently, Somoza?" The fisherman answered. "He is still a little bit dazed a minute ago, when I left him. The handkerchief I flung over his face contained a pretty strong dose. I should give him another 10 minutes before he is ready to face the tribunal." The capture had been easy. Guy Rossett, reckless of danger, had left his flat to pay his visit to Isobel Clandon. 2 members of the secret police were ready to accompany him. Fearful of compromising Isobel, he had rather roughly dispensed with their services. Reluctantly, they had obeyed him. They agreed between themselves that an Englishman was always pig-headed, a bit of a daredevil, and inclined to take risks. Guy walked carelessly along. He was in rather good spirits. He had received that day a cheerful note from Moreno that everything was going well, that very soon the heads of the anarchist movement in Spain would be laid by the heels. Of course, in this letter, Moreno did not explain his methods. If he had done so, Guy might not have been in quite such high spirits. For at this moment, playing his very difficult game of saving Guy Rossett, saving himself and Violet Hargrave, and also snaring the anarchist, Moreno could only give his full confidence to one man, his old friend and companion, Maurice Farquhar. As a matter of fact, Rossett never knew what had really taken place that night. He was never told that Moreno knew of his projected visit to Isobel that evening from a random remark of hers dropped in the afternoon, that he had set Somoza and another tall Biscayan fisherman to follow him for the purpose of bringing him to the house where the heads of the anarchist movement were assembled in solemn conclave. Rossett walked gaily along. He would have a precious hour with Isobel. In a dark street 2 men came up behind him. One pinioned his arms from behind. Somoza pressed a saturated handkerchief over his face. In a few seconds the unfortunate young diplomatist was drugged and helpless. A cab driven by a member of the Brotherhood had crawled slowly after the 2 men. As soon as the driver saw what had happened, he drove rapidly up. The 2 powerful men lifted the inert body into the vehicle. He was partially recovered when they halted at the house where the tribunal of 5 was sitting to pronounce judgment on the man who had dared to thwart their plans. They locked him in a room adjoining that in which Contraras was presiding over the deliberations of his 5 trusted lieutenants. After locking him in securely, Somoza went to report the matter to Moreno. His colleague, the other Biscayan fisherman, remained on guard outside the closed door for fear of untoward accidents. Rossett was a powerful man. Contraras, with his fine intellectual face, his hair in places turning from iron grey to white, looked the embodiment of dignified justice. Perhaps in his warped and fanatical mind he believed he was. He spoke in his most judicial accents. Nobody shall ever say that he has not had a fair trial when brought up before the tribunal of the Brotherhood. We will wait an hour if it is necessary for this misguided young man to recover his senses. Moreno, who had arrived the last of the party, looked round with a sudden start. "Where is our comrade, Violet Hargrave?" Contraras hastened to explain. "Ah, of course you have not heard. Alvedero went to bring her here, according to arrangement. He found her stretched on the sofa, motionless and inanimate. He thinks she is in a dying condition. He is going round to inquire after these proceedings are over." "This is very sad," said Moreno in his gravest manner. "And she is such a nice woman personally, and so devoted to the cause through the influence of Jacques. I wonder," he cast an inquiring look at Alvedero, "if by any chance she drinks or drugs. Many apparently nice women do." Alvedero shook his big head. "I doubt it. I should say a seizure of some sort. Perhaps her heart is weak. She looks a little fragile." Moreno, for obvious reasons, did not pursue the subject. Violet Hargrave's absence had evidently excited no comment, no suspicion. A quarter of an hour had elapsed. Somoza was deputed to enter the locked room and ascertain the condition of the prisoner. Contraras was resolved to proceed justly according to his interpretation of the word justice. Somoza returned after his inspection and reported that the effects of the saturated handkerchief had worn off. Guy Rossett was, in a sense, clothed in his right mind. He was fit to face the tribunal. The members of the conclave assumed masks. Somoza had worn a mask when he had entered the locked room. Whatever happened, it was essential that Guy Rossett should not be able to identify any one of them. The prisoner, or captive, whatever he might be called, was brought in. In the cab he had been bound securely round the legs and wrists, but not painfully. He was assisted to a chair by the masked Somoza, where he sat facing his judges. His face was a little pale, due to the effects of the chloroform, but his demeanour was firm. He felt himself in a very tight corner, but he had been assured so often by Moreno that he need never despair. A good angel, in the shape of Moreno himself, was watching over him. He cast his glance rapidly over the masked men confronting him. Where was the black-browed young journalist whom he had known in the old days? There, on the right, nearest to the door. Had that position been chosen by accident or design? He recognized at once the short, squat figure. Through the holes of the mask he could see the gleam of those dark eyes. His demeanor would be more indomitable than ever. Contraras opened the proceedings in his most judicial manner. "Mr. Rossett, you will recognize that you are now at the mercy of the Brotherhood, against whom for some time you have directed your activities." "Quite true," replied Guy Rossett in his curtest manner. Whatever fate was in store for him, he was not going to knuckle under to this crew of bloodthirsty ruffians. Contraras continued in his calm, imperturbable manner. "I cannot say that, up to the present, you have done us very much harm, but still you are a menace to our schemes, our aspirations. I am pleased to hear that I am of sufficient importance to justify this mock tribunal." Rossett waved his hand contemptuously at the masked men sitting in judgment on him. The eyes of Contraras flashed through his mask. He took his position very seriously. "Mr. Rossett, let me advise you in your own interest not to carry matters with too high a hand. Kindly recognize your position. If you were seated in the Calle Fernando el Santo, I admit you would be top dog. At the present moment the Brotherhood, here in this obscure house, in this obscure quarter of the city of Madrid, is in that enviable situation." A bitter retort was on Rossett's lips, but he thought he perceived an almost imperceptible gesture of warning from the short, squat figure in the corner near the door. He temporized. "The fortunes of war, I admit, are with you, sir. I am sorry I have not had the advantage of knowing whom I have the honour to address." Contraras was at heart a gentleman. He felt the sting of the rebuke. "Mr. Rossett, if you come into line with us tonight, I may deal with you quite frankly. Before we separate, you may know as much about me as I do about you." There was an obvious movement on the part of Zorrilta and Alvedero. They evidently thought their chief was going too far. Contraras hushed the incipient rebellion with an authoritative wave of his hand. "Gentlemen, kindly leave me to deal with this matter. Mr. Rossett and I will understand each other in a very few moments." He turned towards the young diplomatist, still undaunted in the midst of this hostile crowd. "Mr. Rossett, you have much to lose by opposing us, perhaps life itself. By withdrawing from this unequal contest, and believe me, it is unequal, you have much to gain." "I am not so sure it is unequal," answered Guy Rossett stubbornly. He had perceived too late the warning signal of Moreno, anxious that the somewhat uncertain Contraras should not be deflected from his present calm, judicial mood. But Contraras kept his temper. "Mr. Rossett, you are a young man, with life, a happy and prosperous life, before you. I know a good deal about you. It is my business to know much about other people. You are engaged to a very charming girl. You will inherit a great fortune from a wealthy aunt. And if you could establish your principles," broke in Guy, speaking with some heat, "you might take away from me my fiancée. You would certainly rob me of my fortune." But Contraras was still patient. He was trying to reason with this obstinate young man, whose bold bearing moved his admiration. "We cannot tell how the great revolution will shape itself ultimately. But let us deal with present facts. A charming girl is waiting for you, longing for the moment when she can be your wife." A shadow of pain passed over Guy's face. Tonight he had set out to visit his beloved Isobel, and he had been snared. Contraras watched him naturally through the eyes of his mask. "And a big fortune will be yours very shortly. Are you prepared to give up these advantages for the sake of thwarting the Brotherhood?" "I rather think I am. But tell me what you propose. I admit you are arguing in a most temperate fashion, but you have something up your sleeve all the same." "I have," admitted Contraras frankly. "Mr. Rossett, believe me, I have no personal animosity against you, except as the tool of a decaying and effete system. Come into line with me and your bonds shall be loosed, and you shall go forth a free man." "Your conditions?" queried Rossett in a hard voice. "Take your solemn oath, no, Give me your word as an English gentleman, I will accept that you will resign your position at the Embassy and take no further action against the Brotherhood." He rose and pointed at the door. "Give me that promise, Mr. Rossett, and you can walk out a free man." If Guy hesitated a moment, his hesitation must be pardoned. In that swift instant he thought of Isobel, anxiously waiting his arrival, his dear sister Mary, anxious and troubled also, even his father, whose maladroit interference in his affairs had sent him into this hotbed of disaffection. Then he spoke slowly and deliberately. "You invite me to dishonour myself in order to secure my own personal safety. My answer is, no, do your worst." "You will not reconsider that decision, Mr. Rossett?" Guy shook his head. "No, 1,000 times no. Do what you like with me. I am a defenceless man. You can murder me here and probably hush up your crime. But I shall be avenged. You can reckon on that." Contraras rose and paced the room in great agitation. He was a brave man himself. He admired the quality of bravery in others. Fanatical and resolute as he was, it went against the grain to condemn this young Englishman to death because he would not accept the dishonourable terms offered to him. "Mr. Rossett, I wish to spare you. The Brotherhood does not condemn in haste." He turned to Somoza. "Take this gentleman to his room, and bring him here in a quarter of an hour. Perhaps by that time he will take a more reasonable view of his position." "Come, Signor, if you please," said the obedient Somoza, speaking through his mask in the most polite tones. "A Spaniard is always courteous, even if he is about to murder you." The fisherman bent down to assist his prisoner to rise, but before Rossett was firmly on his legs, the short, squat figure of Moreno got up from his chair. He laid his finger to his lips and looked round at the assembly. "Silence, gentlemen, for a moment. I am sure I heard the sound of a whistle. Yes, there is another one. Did you catch it?" No, nobody had caught it except Moreno. He stole gently to the window and pulled the blind an inch aside. He dropped it hastily and staggered back in a state of extreme agitation. In that apparently unconscious movement he had drawn nearer to the door. "Dios!" he cried in a shrill voice. "The house is surrounded. There are dozens of men outside." The pulling aside of the blind was a signal he had arranged with his friend, the head of the police. The pretence of the whistle was a blind. There was a heavy trampling on the stairs. Almost before he had ceased speaking, the locked door was burst open to admit the members of the police with levelled revolvers covering the masked men. 2 of the unwelcome visitors seized Somoza and handcuffed him. A third cut the secure but not painful ropes that bound Rossett and conducted him down the narrow staircase. A cab was waiting. His guardian bundled the young man in. Was it a dream? Isobel's soft arms were round him. Isobel's soft voice was whispering to him, "My darling, you are safe. Moreno has kept his promise." Rossett was bewildered. No wonder. He had hardly yet recovered from the effects of the drug which had been administered by Somoza. His head fell back on her shoulder. "Isobel, my dear sweetheart, you here, what does it mean?" "It means that you were saved through Moreno and my cousin Maurice Farquhar." She felt it was no time to palter with the truth. "Your cousin, Maurice Farquhar? What has he to do with it all?" She was pleased to note that there was no suspicion in his tones, only the expression of bewilderment. "Oh, it would take hours to explain, but I will cut it as short as I can. My cousin and Moreno are great friends. Maurice has come over here to help him. I was expecting you tonight, as you will remember. Maurice came round to explain that you had been kidnapped. He was coming on here as Moreno's lieutenant, to help the police. I implored him to take me along, to welcome you when you escaped from them. He consented, and here I am." Guy clasped her in his arms. "You darling, and where is Mr. Farquhar? I would like to thank him." Isobel beckoned to a man standing a little way in the shadow. He advanced. "Maurice, Guy wishes to thank you for all your share in this night's work." The 2 men exchanged a cordial handshake. Guy muttered his thanks. "I would like to tell you to drive off straight away," said Farquhar, "but you must wait a minute or two. There will be a third occupant of this vehicle. Our friend Moreno, who is going to pass the night at the house of the Chief of Police. Tomorrow he will go to England." In the room from which Rossett had been conducted to his friendly guardian, the head of the police was taking the situation in hand. "Masks off, if you please, gentlemen," he cried out in stentorian tones. The men turned hesitatingly to each other, but the levelled revolvers had an eloquence that was very appealing. They tore off their masks and flung them on the floor. The chief scrutinized them in turn, offering audible comments. "Ah, Contraras, the dark horse of the conspiracy, connected with the Spanish nobility through your wife. I think I have met you at court. Alvedero, ah, for some time you have been suspect. Zorrilta, I know you well, governor of the province of Nava." He pointed to Somoza. "This gentleman I do not know. We shall find something about him later on." He turned to Moreno, who preserved an impassive demeanour. "I have not the honour of knowing this gentleman either," he said, with a splendid disregard of the truth, for which Moreno admired him immensely. "But no doubt I shall shortly atone for my ignorance. I shall have something to say to him later on." He turned to his subordinates. "Handcuff them, and take them along." Moreno all the time had been edging nearer to the door. Suddenly he pulled out a knife and hurled himself at the man who was guarding it. The man went down before the apparently savage onslaught. Moreno rushed down the stairs. "After him!" yelled the chief. "Don't let that man escape!" 3 of the waiting men clattered down the stairs after the flying Moreno. They returned a few moments later, crestfallen. They explained that he had flown like the wind, that they had lost him in the darkness. The chief swore roundly and cursed them. "Dolts! Idiots!" he cried fiercely. "You have let him slip through your fingers. I believe he is the most dangerous man of the lot." He was certainly playing his part splendidly. It had, of course, all been rehearsed. The man on whom Moreno had sprung had fallen down of his own accord. The men who had been dispatched to pursue him had lost him on purpose. Farquhar met him at the door of the shabby house, and piloted him to the cab in which Guy, Rossett, and Isobel were seated. "Here is the third passenger," he said. Moreno got in and looked triumphantly at the two. "Well, what do you think of the English Secret Service?" he cried in exultant tones. "Mr. Rossett is saved, I have escaped without suspicion, and my good friend the Chief of Police will make a splendid haul upstairs. He played up splendidly. Well, I think after tonight the anarchist movement will have a big setback in Spain." The cab drove along. Isobel was deposited at the Godwins. Rossett was put down at his own flat. Moreno was conveyed to the residence of the Chief of Police, where he was to pass the night. A telegram was awaiting Guy. It was from his sister Mary. "I was summoned to Aunt Henrietta this morning. She had passed away before I had arrived." End of chapter 22. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com. Chapter 23 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 23. The next morning, Guy, Rossett, and Farquhar were admitted to a private audience of the King. A gracious message had been transmitted to Moreno through the agency of the Chief of Police. It would not have been very politic on the part of that enterprising young man to show himself at the palace. His Majesty thanked them both warmly for their services, and was very interested in the details which they gave him of that eventful evening. "I know England well and love it," he said. "As long as she breeds such sons as you, she will always remain the first of great nations. Last night's work was good. My poor country will have a more peaceful time now that we have laid these bloodthirsty scoundrels by the heels." Moreno's overpowering impulse was to get back to England as quickly as possible. But there was a certain duty to perform first. He must pay his promised visit to Violet Hargrave. He called about 11 o'clock. He found her looking pale and languid from the effects of the powerful mixture he had given her. Pulling round, he inquired as they shook hands, "I can see you are, but you won't be quite yourself for a few hours. Well, tell me what happened. I arrived late at the meeting, and simply heard from Contraras that Alvedero had reported you were indisposed." but I learned no details and, of course, did not press for any. Did they fetch a doctor to you? If so, what is his verdict?" A faint smile spread over her pale face. "He has only left a few minutes ago. He came to the conclusion that I dosed myself with drugs. I allowed him to believe that I did. Of course, I have never drugged in my life." "A very clever man, an ornament to his profession," remarked Moreno dryly. "Still, how the devil should he guess, being totally ignorant of the circumstances? And the symptoms were precisely those which would have been produced by a long course of drugging." Mrs Hargrave laid her hand upon his arm and spoke in a serious voice. "What of last night? There is nothing in the papers this morning. I have sent out for half a dozen. Tell me what happened." "The Brotherhood has been defeated again." He rehearsed the scene for her benefit, and came to the concluding portion. "Just as they were about to remove Rossett, I distinctly heard a low whistle that was repeated a few seconds later. I just pulled aside the curtain and saw that the house was surrounded. I had hardly put the blind back when the door was burst open and the police swarmed in. They cut Rossett loose and took him downstairs. They covered us with revolvers and made us take off our masks. The chief who was with them recognized Contraras, Zirilto, and Alvedero. Myself and Somoza he did not recognize." "Ah!" Violet Hargrave drew a long breath. "You were the only one who escaped, then? How did you manage it?" "By a miracle. I always keep my head in a crisis. As soon as I heard them rushing up the stairs, I drew near to the door, hoping to escape in the confusion. It was, of course, 1,000 to 1 chance. While all the attention was being concentrated on Contraras and the others, of course the chief didn't expect to bag such a big game, I drew my knife, plunged it into the breast of the man guarding the door. I fear I killed him, poor fellow. Flew down the stairs, knocked over another chap, and dodged through them." Violet Hargrave surveyed him critically. "I'm afraid you haven't a very high opinion of my intelligence. That is the story you will tell to Lucue, Maceda, and Jacques when we meet again in London. It does not impose upon me. You have escaped right enough, but you escaped with the connivance of the police." Moreno bit his lip. He had presumed a little too much upon feminine incredulity. "At any rate, you are not in their clutches," he said quietly. "I saved you. Don't forget that." She reached out her hand. "Please forgive me. I am very grateful for what you have done. Of course, if I had gone there, you could not have saved me. I should have been taken with the others. You could save Guy Rossett and yourself. Even your clever brain could not have taken in a third. I repeat, I am very grateful." Moreno retained her hand in his. Secretive as he was by nature, he felt that the time for dissimulation was past. "When we get to London, I am leaving tonight, and the sooner we make tracks the better, we will respect each other's secrets. I have still in my possession the photographed copy of that document which you sold to Guy Rossett." She drew away her hand from his with an indignant gesture. "Oh, you think I am utterly, irretrievably base!" she cried bitterly. "You think I would betray you after what you have done for me? Save me from death or a lifelong imprisonment?" She broke into wild sobbing. He put his arm round her and drew her gently towards him till her crying ceased. "My poor little Violet," he whispered gently, "let us speak together quite frankly. You are, on your own showing, an adventuress with, I believe, some very womanly instincts. Well, I am not quite sure that I am very much better. You sold the cause for money. I sold it for money too, plus conviction. I wonder if we could turn over a new leaf, lead a new life together." "If I could find somebody who really cared for me," cried the pretty little blonde woman, still tearful. "Jacques loves me, I am sure, but just with the love of a father." "Well, I care for you," said Moreno, and this time he spoke without any reservation. Violet lifted her face to his, and their lips met. Then she shivered. "But how can we escape from this horrible brotherhood? Lucue and Jacques are left. They will exact their pound of flesh. They will snare us into equally dangerous enterprises." Moreno snapped his fingers. "Bah! If I have outwitted Contraras and the others, I will soon settle Lucue's hash. As to poor old Jacques, It won't take long to convince him that he is more safely employed in earning 100% on his capital than in trying to blow up respectable people who have certainly never injured him. The fate of the others will frighten him." Violet drew herself from his protecting arm and dried her eyes. "I think, dear, I can really turn into a good woman," she said plaintively. "You see, I have never had a proper chance. When I married Jack, and I was genuinely fond of him, I thought I had met a gentleman. Can you guess what he really was?" "A card sharper?" suggested Moreno with his uncanny facility of guessing conundrums. Mrs. Hargrave nodded her blonde head. "You have hit it. A week after we were married, he told me all about himself. We were to take an expensive flat in Mount Street, and he would bring people there. He spent 3 weeks in teaching me an elaborate system of signalling. As a rule we played together, but he had another couple of confederates to ward off suspicion." "Did you tell Jacques of this?" "No, I was too ashamed. Jacques is, of course, a rogue in his own way, but not that way. He was opposed to the marriage at first, and I was keen on it. I made out that Jack was a man of good family and well off. I believed all he told me at the start. I didn't want to own that I had been taken in." "I quite understand," replied Moreno. "By the way, of course you didn't know that poor old Contraras is dead." "Contraras dead? How did he die?" "It appears that he always carried some poisoned tablets in his pocket in case of accidents. Before they handcuffed him, they are a bit slower here than in Paris or London, he swallowed one of them, and died as they took him downstairs. Poor old man, he was a terrible fanatic, but he was more honest than most of them. I don't suppose there will be much mourning in Fitzjohn's Avenue. I expect his family will be glad to have got rid of him." He kissed her very tenderly as he bade her good-bye. "A new life, little woman, from today?" "A new life from today," she repeated softly, "as long as I am sure that you really care." "I do care," replied Moreno, speaking with unusual fervour for a man of his cautious temperament. Of the London section of the Brotherhood little remains to be told. Shortly afterwards Lucsuet was stabbed to death in a violent quarrel with a brother anarchist. Jacques and Maceda, alarmed at the fate of their Spanish colleagues, took but a perfunctory part in further propaganda. In 12 months' time the London section had ceased to exist as an active force. On a mellow October day, a few months after those thrilling events in Madrid, Isobel was married in the quiet little church on her uncle's estates. It was in this church that her father had been christened. Her bridesmaids were Lady Mary and 2 cousins. Her uncle, the head of the family, gave her away. For the head of the family and his wife had behaved quite properly on the occasion. They had insisted that she should be married from their house, that she should have the whole-hearted support of her kindred. Such an arrangement suited her very well. Her bereavement had been so recent that the idea of a fashionable wedding would have been repugnant to her. Here in this quiet little church, where generations of Clandons had been christened, many of them married, she gave herself to the man of her choice. With the advent of his great aunt's considerable fortune, Guy's brief fit of ambition died out. And it must be admitted that, although he had stuck gallantly to his post and refused to show the white feather, his experience of diplomatic life had been more exciting than pleasant. So he severed his connection with the Foreign Office, having made up his mind to lead the easy and agreeable life of a man of wealth and position. They were to spend their honeymoon in Italy. On their return, they would renovate Aunt Henrietta's charming country residence in Hampshire, and take a house in London where they intended to spend a good deal of their time. For Guy was very proud of his beautiful Isobel, and he could see a time when she would become a very charming and popular hostess. The young couple drove away amidst the cordial greetings of the small company assembled. Only a few intimate connections of the 2 families remained. Moreno had been invited, but he had excused himself on some plausible pretext. He had no desire to thrust himself into an aristocratic milieu to which he was unaccustomed. He sent the bride a very handsome present, with a card on which was written, "From Andres Moreno, as a souvenir of thrilling times in Spain." When Lord Saxham was saying good-bye to the Clandons, Maurice Farquhar conducted Lady Mary to the car which was to drive them back to Ticehurst Park, a distance of about 50 miles. "You will not forget that you are due to us on the 25th," she reminded him as they shook hands. "Is it likely? I have been looking forward to it ever since you sent me the invitation." "I am looking forward to it too," said Mary softly, and a rather becoming colour swept over her cheek, making her look quite attractive. The Earl joined them and mounted the car. He waved his hand cheerfully as they drove off. "Not good bye, but au revoir, Farquhar. See you on the 25th." He watched the car drive out of sight, thinking of many things. He had loved Isobel with all the fervour of first love, but Isobel was gone from him. And Mary was very sweet and attractive, and took no pains to conceal that she took great pleasure in his society. Well, perhaps some day. But even in his secret thought the young and ambitious barrister could hardly bring himself to believe that a girl of Mary's birth and long descent would give herself to a man who had only his brains to recommend him. Still, this younger generation of the Rossetts had a strange democratic strain in them. Guy had chosen his bride from the small squirearchy. It was openly rumoured in the clubs that, having come into a snug little income from Great Aunt Henrietta, Lord Ticehurst had made up his mind to marry his chorus girl and defy his father. Lady Mary had also been well provided from the same kind source. She might prove as democratic as the others. And while Farquhar was ruminating over all these things, Isobel and her husband had set out on the first stage of their journey to the enchanted land of wedded romance. This is the end of Whither Thou Goest by William Le Queux. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.